I'm Jerry Prokopovich at East Carolina University. Welcome to Civil War Talk Radio. There's no better way to immerse oneself in the era of the Civil War than to visit one of the many battlefields of that conflict. Today, some of those serene pastoral fields are still the scenes of conflict as people argue about how or whether to develop, preserve, and interpret them. For an inside look at the battlefields today, join us and our guest, Donald C. Fonz, biographer of Confederate General Richard Ewell and historian at the Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. We'll be back with Don Fonz on Civil War Talk Radio.
Onboard computers to improve fuel efficiency and reduce emissions.
Check.
Acoustic and optical wayside monitors to enhance safety.
Check.
Robotic systems to measure track geometry.
Check.
GPS tracking and tracing systems.
Check.
Sounds like a rocket or a jet getting ready for takeoff, doesn't it? Actually, it's something just as technologically advanced. A freight train. There's a new world of technology riding the rails that makes today's freight railroads more fuel efficient, safer, and cleaner running than ever. With wireless communications, transponders, and trackside readers that can pinpoint a shipment's location at speeds of up to 80 miles an hour, North America's freight railroads are driving the technology required by today's businesses and consumers. And with everything from apples to computers moving by rail, we wouldn't have it any other way. Chances are, the things you'll use tomorrow are taking the train today. Tomorrow, arriving by train. Sponsored by North America's Freight Railroads.
Mission critical. 2 words that describe the data vital to every e-commerce website. If your company needs the services of an unparalleled co-location facility, you need to remember these 2 words: Castle Access. With Castle Access, your internet servers will be secure in environmentally controlled data centers that offer high-speed managed internet access and the highest standards of 24/7 customer support. For more info, visit castleaccess.com. Castle Access. We keep you online all the time.
World Talk Radio, bringing the world to you.
Welcome to Civil War Talk Radio. I'm Jerry Prokopovich. With me today is Donald C. Fonz, author of the standard biography of Richard S. Ewell and historian at the Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania Military Park. Good morning, Don. How are you doing?
Good morning. Fine, thank you.
Glad to have you on the show today. I thought we'd start by asking what got you interested, whenever it was, how many years ago, in the era of the Civil War.
Well, I grew up in Civil War parks. My father was a historian at Gettysburg National Battlefield. In fact, he's still the foremost authority on Gettysburg. And so I grew up as a child there and ran around the battlefields, grew to love the place, and that kind of got me interested in history. For a while, I kind of veered off into colonial history more during my school years. But then after college, I got a job at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park, and from that point on, I've been directing my energies more toward the Civil War.
So your father is Harry Fonz, the historian, is that right?
That's correct.
We talked with, a few weeks ago on the show, we talked with Jeff Shera, who of course is the son of Michael Shera, author of The Killer Angels, and I asked him I asked him about his father's work. Can I ask you the same question?
Sure.
Well, your father, of course, is famous for those very big books on Gettysburg, the big orange books, which I can recall.
The first one's the big orange one, yeah.
That I vividly remember seeing that in a bookstore in Boston. It must have been in the early 90s, late 80s, perhaps.
Yeah, when it came out.
I'm sorry?
That's roughly when it came out, yeah.
And just thinking, wow, this is what I've been looking for. Now I will really know what is going on at Gettysburg. This is a level of detail that no one has really attempted ever before. Mm-hmm. But I will frankly say that after I read it, I thought, okay, I know enough about it now. It really is a micro history. And what are your thoughts on that style?
Well, it depends on, again, who you're writing for. Obviously, if you're somebody who has this kind of either a beginner in the Civil War or somebody who has just a very mild interest, you don't want to pick up a book like those written by my father, because they're written to be the last word, to get into all the details of a battle. And some people are looking exactly for that. They want to know everything there is to know about a certain little phase of the fighting. And so for them, those books are a gold mine. For your more average tourist, they would probably want to stick to something much shorter and with much less detail.
I wonder. There certainly is an audience for those that style of history, and I'm not saying this to denigrate it at all. I very much enjoyed reading that. I simply concluded I couldn't master that level of detail. Mm-hmm. But now there are others who have followed in those footsteps. There's a book, I understand, on the Battle of Mill Springs, for example, in Kentucky, 1862, that tops 500 pages mm-hmm. in presenting that same kind of detail. And while I don't think it's hard to justify such a book on Gettysburg, I do wonder if we aren't reaching a point of diminishing returns in spending 500 pages on Mill Springs.
Yeah. Well, again, it just depends on each individual reader. Again, I think most people who visit a Civil War park, for instance, know only a limited amount about the battle, and for them, something much more general would be more than sufficient. But again, there are those handful of people who, for whatever reasons, have extreme interest in the details of battles. And for them, a detailed book on either Gettysburg or Mill Spring, again, is exactly what they're looking for. It's not a large audience, but they are out there, and it's nice to have books for people like that.
Oh, that's true. And I suppose the audience size declines with the relative fame of the battle, but mm-hmm. even there, it is interesting to see that the interest does exist for even some of the more obscure events.
Right.
Now, you yourself have written books. You've written a biography of Richard Ewell, one of Lee's corps commanders, of course, in the Army of Northern Virginia. What brought you to that subject?
Actually, I got interested in General Ewell back in I guess it was early 80s, when there was a symposium being given up in the Shenandoah Valley on the 1862 Shenandoah Valley campaign. And I was asked to give a talk on one of the leaders, and so ultimately I chose General Ewell, who I quickly discovered didn't really have any good books written about him. And so I decided to take the notes I'd written from my talk and write a booklet. And as I did more research, the booklet became a book, and as I did more research beyond that, the book became a big book. So now I've got a big fat book like my father's.
And but a fascinating one, certainly. That's not to say your father's book is not fascinating either by any means. But Ewell has apparently been underserved by historians before you. Why do you suppose that is?
I'm not really sure, except that he, of course, he didn't have the success that Jackson or Lee or Stuart did, and didn't have quite that dashing aura of a Stuart. But I am myself somewhat perplexed as to why he's gotten so little press over the years. When you consider people like Longstreet, even A.P. Hill, of course Lee, Jackson, Stuart, Jubal Early, even all those people have gotten a fair amount of publicity. For instance, if you look at the prints that are out there today, of course, there's a lot of artists doing Civil War prints. And you look around and almost, when they focus on an individual Confederate leader here in the East, it's almost always Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson or occasionally Jeb Stuart. Once in a blue moon, you get a Jubal Early or John Gordon, for instance. But I think Ewell is featured, as far as I know, in only one modern painting out of the hundreds and hundreds that have been done. And in that case, he's a figure in the background, and Jubal Early is the primary figure, or John Gordon. So it's quite interesting that Ewell's always kind of taken a back seat, and I'm not 100% sure why, because there's plenty of source material on him. He was one of the most important Confederate leaders, served during the entire war, with the exception of the period when he was out injured. And he's a very fascinating character. He's quite amusing and interesting to read about. So I don't really know, but I saw the void there, and I thought I'd try to fill it.
Now, the voids in Civil War writing are harder and harder to find, and this really is a remarkable one. think you've pointed out Lee had 7 commanders at the corps level through the war, and 5 of them we have tons of books on, and Ewell and Richard Anderson we have so little on, and Anderson is maybe justly a bit more obscure, but Ewell was at Gettysburg, Ewell was in the Valley, Ewell did all these things, and we don't hear much about him.
Yeah, he was very closely associated not only with Lee, but of course with Jackson, and you think just the reflected light from those two gentlemen would cause him to stand out a little bit more, but again, for whatever reason, he's kind of gotten short shrift. Now, that I have to quickly add that's changing. There are, in addition to the book that I wrote in the last 10, 15 years, a couple other biographies have come out as well. So he is starting to get a little bit more attention.
You suggested he's an interesting character. But it's not just that he's important, but he's worth writing about. What sort of things stand out to you about Ewell that make him such an interesting character?
Well, of course, his primary interest is what he did during the Civil War. But in addition to that, he was at West Point. So if you're interested in the U.S. Military Academy and everything that went on there, he has some interest in that regard. He also had a much longer career out on the western frontier, and also served in Mexico. So he kind of gets into all these different events that are taking place in the mid-19th century. And so he's interesting in terms of what he's doing and where he's at. But he's also just, I think, a very interesting personality. He's got kind of a very quirky personality. Ewell's ancestors had intermarried, and as a result, the Ewell family was a little bit eccentric in their own ways, and Dick certainly reflected that. And he had a lot of very interesting traits, but he also had some very quirky personality traits, which are played up perhaps too much even by Douglas Southall Freeman in his book Lee's Lieutenants. He talks about Ewell's quirky personality traits and how he looked like a big ungainly bird and would lisp out these kind of peculiar humorous quips and things. But he's a very intelligent, very humorous, very down to earth sort of fellow, and I found reading about him, I just found that he was just fun to read about.
Well, I must admit that Freeman's word picture has stuck in my mind. A picture of this bald fellow with a large beak-like nose, sort of bird appearance, doing or saying slightly eccentric things. And I think in Freeman's era, Bruce Catton, to some extent, also used to characterize their characters by one or two phrases. Catton would especially do that to keep the reader reminded who he was talking about. But when you characterize somebody by one or two words, you certainly miss the full picture of them. And you're suggesting Ewell was more than just an eccentric, amusing fellow.
Exactly. Nothing that Freeman says about Ewell as far as his eccentricities is really wrong. The problem is that if you just focus on the person's eccentricity, sometimes you can forget that there was a lot more to the person than simply that. And what I think is often lost in Freeman's books and in some of the other things written about Ewell is that Ewell is an officer who was very capable, had long service in the West, commanding different posts out there. He, for instance, had dealings with Cochise and Kit Carson and people like that. He was very highly respected in the Army amongst the people who knew him, and actually did an extremely good job almost everywhere he went. And all that tends to get obscured, A, by his eccentricities, and also B, by the really, unfortunately, one episode, and that episode that kind of is pinned on Ewell and people remember by is Gettysburg. And, of course, he fought in dozens of battles, Gettysburg just being one, and unfortunately he's remembered just for that one day at that one battle.
Well, that anticipates where I was going to ask you next, what I was going to ask you next, which is what happened at Gettysburg. He is remembered, as you say, for his performance, especially on the first day there when the Confederate forces come in on the flank of the Union Army, and he, I would say fortuitously, has his divisions arriving at just the right moment and fails. Well, you tell the story. What happens there?
Well, as you said, the the meeting at Gettysburg was unexpected by both sides. A.P. Hill's Confederate Corps was heading to the town and clashed there with Union cavalry, and at the same time you have the first elements of the Army of the Potomac's infantry coming up to support them, the 1st Corps, followed by the 11th Corps. And as that battle is taking place between Hill and that portion of the Union Army, Ewell arrives on the scene fortuitously right on the flank of the troops that are facing Hill. And at that point, Ewell himself becomes engaged, and in some various attacks, essentially he and Hill drive the Federals back through the town of Gettysburg in entire disarray. The Federals begin to take to rally on some hills south of town, particularly on Cemetery Hill. And at that point, that's the kind of the critical point in Ewell's career, because the Confederates had the momentum going, and historians, looking back, and even people at the time, for that matter, felt that if the Confederates had just pushed ahead, specifically Ewell had pushed ahead, they could have taken Cemetery Hill, and there would have never been a Battle of Gettysburg, and the South might have gone on to win the war. That's kind of the theory. And unfortunately, it's a very pat theory, but it ignores kind of the realities on the battlefield that day. It's true that the Federals were routed and falling back, and the Confederates did have momentum. That much is true. What it tends to ignore is the strength of the Federal position and the difficulties that Ewell was facing within his own corps. The Federals had a very strong position, as anybody who goes to Cemetery Hill will recognize. They had 40 cannons, a massive amount of cannons up on that hill. They had cleared fields of fire so the cannons could mow down anything that was coming at them. They didn't have a huge amount of infantry support, but they had at least one intact infantry brigade there, and you take that together with the fragments of the other brigades that are now rallying up on that hill, you may have had as many as 10,000, 12,000 Federals there, protected by stone walls. So you have these open fields, stone walls, so you have the Union infantry who can protect themselves behind the walls, the Union artillery who can fire from the hill. And then to attack that, you have Ewell. Now, his troops had already marched a great deal that day. He had 3 divisions, one of which had taken heavy casualties. And the other division had only 3/4 of its troops at hand and was burdened with about 5,000 prisoners. So when you start...
And the 3rd Division wasn't even there yet.
The 3rd Division wasn't even up yet. So Ewell, when you start looking at what Ewell actually had to attack that extremely formidable hill, he has perhaps 5,000 effective troops to attack a hill that's extremely strong, that has 40 cannon and maybe 10 to 12,000 troops defending it. And it's easy to look back and say, well, they were riding the crest of success. They should have gone forward. But had he done so, I think most serious students of Gettysburg today agree that it would have been a massacre. They would have simply, lost the momentum real quickly, and at the cost of several thousand casualties.
So it would have been Malvern Hill all over again.
Exactly, except maybe even worse.
Only worse.
Yeah, because you're attacking this again just a part of your army. But and then there are other things as well which people don't give much weight to, and that is...
I'm just going to interrupt you there because we need to take a break, but we're going to come back and talk more about Ewell at Gettysburg and about Civil War battlefields in general. We'll do that when we come back on Civil War Talk Radio.